The morning of October 25th, 1944, began like a lie. The sea off Samar was calm, too calm for what was coming. The sky was washed pale gold, and the only sound was the low hum of the engines aboard a handful of American escort carriers and their tiny screens of destroyers. Men on deck drank coffee from tin mugs. Some laughed, some stared at the horizon. No one knew that in less than an hour the Pacific would erupt into one of the most desperate, uneven battles in naval history. They called them tin cans. Thin-skinned, undergunned, built to escort convoys, not to fight battleships. On paper, the destroyers of Task Unit 77.4.3, codenamed Taffy 3, had no chance. Against them was a storm of steel. The Japanese center force, led by Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, emerging from the dawn mist with the thunder of the Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, at its heart. The odds were impossible, and yet what followed that morning would defy every line ever written in a manual of war. At 0647 hours, the horizon broke. A lookout aboard the escort carrier Fanshawe Bay shouted, "Ships sighted, many ships, bearing 000. For a moment, there was disbelief. Japanese battleships and cruisers were supposed to be retreating, hammered by American submarines and aircraft days earlier. But through the morning haze, silhouettes rose, tall, dark, and unmistakable. Pagoda masts, long, slender hulls, the glint of heavy guns, then the first orange flash. Shells screamed over the waves, armor-piercing, meant for battleships, landing among the American carriers like iron rain. The tin cans were suddenly in the path of the most powerful surface fleet remaining in the Imperial Japanese Navy. You can imagine the bridge of the destroyer USS Johnston in that moment. Commander Ernest E. Evans, half Cherokee, half Scots-Irish, stood over the chart table, eyes fixed on the enemy. He had a reputation, bold, impulsive, fiercely protective of his crew. When he spoke, he did so quietly, with conviction. That morning, he said only one thing. "All right, boys, we're going in." He knew what that meant. Everyone did. The Johnston, barely 2,100 tons, faced battleships 30 times her size, with guns that could hit from 20 miles away. The destroyer's main guns? 5-inch pop guns that could barely scratch armor. But Evans didn't flinch. To retreat meant the escort carriers and the thousands of men aboard them would be slaughtered. So he turned toward the storm. The Japanese commanders on the bridge of the Yamato and Congo laughed when they saw what was charging them. "Destroyers," one officer said. "Little ones." They called them tin cans in contempt. Fragile, expendable, not worth aiming at. They were wrong. As Johnston accelerated into the rising waves, the ship shuddered from the strain. Water sprayed across her bow. Men clung to rails slick with oil and salt. Gunners loaded shells by hand. On the horizon, black water erupted where battleship rounds landed, each impact a small earthquake. Evans' voice came through the intercom. "Commence torpedo attack. Full speed ahead." It was not bravery. It was defiance. A deliberate act of madness born from duty. Behind Johnston, other destroyers followed, Hull, Heermann, and the smaller destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts. They were never meant to fight battleships. They were meant to protect carriers, chase submarines, guard convoys. Yet now, outnumbered and outgunned, they turned and charged as one. Each man aboard those ships understood the stakes. There was no grand strategy, no expectation of survival. Only time, minutes to buy for the slow escort carriers to flee eastward. The radio crackled with calm voices. "Enemy in sight. Range 20,000 yards. Opening fire." And then, chaos. The sea lit up with tracer fire. Explosions rolled like thunder across the water. Shells whistled over the decks, tearing air and steel alike. Men shouted orders drowned by the roar of engines and guns. Somewhere behind them, planes from the carriers took off, armed with whatever bombs they had left, some even carrying depth charges because the real ammunition was gone. History would remember it as the battle off Samar, the smallest, most improbable naval battle of the Pacific War. But in that first hour, no one thought of history. They thought of home, of the woman waiting, of the child unborn, of the ship beneath their feet and the men beside them. As dawn spread across the Philippine Sea, a handful of tin cans disappeared into the gunfire, charging toward giants. And for the first time in the Pacific War, the hunters would become the hunted. Before Samar, there was Leyte. In October 1944, the Pacific had begun to turn red. American forces, led by General Douglas MacArthur, had returned to the Philippines, the fulfillment of his promise, "I shall return." The invasion of Leyte Island was meant to sever Japan's supply lines from the oil-rich Dutch East Indies. Without that oil, Japan's empire would slowly suffocate. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, this was the moment of truth. Their air power was shattered, their fuel reserves were almost gone, but pride and desperation still burned. The combined fleet, once the terror of the Pacific, now faced a decision that would define its final chapter: fight and die with honor, or retreat and fade into silence. They chose to fight. Operation Shogo. Victory Operation. The plan was as bold as it was suicidal, a last throw of the dice. The Japanese fleet would strike the American invasion force at Leyte Gulf from 3 directions. To the north, Admiral Ozawa's decoy carrier force would lure Admiral Halsey's fast carriers away. To the south, Admiral Nishimura would attack through Surigao Strait. And from the center, through the narrow passage of San Bernardino Strait, Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force, the most powerful surface fleet Japan had left, would fall upon the unsuspecting American invasion fleet from behind. Kurita's force was immense: 4 battleships, including the monstrous Yamato and Nagato, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, 11 destroyers. Together, over 300,000 tons of steel and firepower. Against them, at the far eastern flank of the invasion, lay the small escort groups known as the Taffys. Taffy 1, Taffy 2, and Taffy 3, each made up of slow escort carriers and their tiny screens of destroyers and destroyer escorts. Their mission was simple: provide air support to the troops landing on Leyte, guard against submarines, and chase off small surface threats. They were never meant to face battleships. They were never meant to stand in a fleet action. But war rarely respects intentions. On the night of October 24th, the American commanders believed Kurita's force had been destroyed. Earlier that day, U.S. submarines Darter and Dace had ambushed his fleet in the Palawan Passage, sinking 2 heavy cruisers and damaging a 3rd. Later, American aircraft from Admiral Halsey's carriers struck again in the Sibuyan Sea, pounding the Yamato and sending the great battleship Musashi to the bottom. Reports came in: enemy retreating west. Relief swept through the American fleet. The center force, it seemed, had been broken. But it hadn't. In the fading light of October 24th, Kurita regrouped. Battered, shaken, but unbroken, he steered his fleet toward the San Bernardino Strait. Behind him, the sea was littered with oil and bodies. Ahead, only darkness and the chance for redemption. No one saw him coming. Admiral Halsey, believing the main Japanese threat to be the northern carrier decoy, turned his fast battleships and carriers northward, away from the invasion fleet. The San Bernardino Strait, the very gateway to the vulnerable landing forces, was left unguarded. It was a gap of fate. In the early hours of October 25th, under the cover of rain squalls and pre-dawn mist, Kurita's fleet slipped through the strait and into the open waters east of Samar. There, scattered across the pale morning sea, were the ships of Taffy 3. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague commanded Taffy 3. 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. His ships were small, his weapons light. His carriers, like Gambier Bay and Fanshawe Bay, carried aircraft equipped for ground support, not for attacking capital ships. The destroyers, Johnston, Howell, Heermann, were their only shields. Thin hulls, no armor. Crews barely 300 men each. Their speed and courage were their only defenses. At 0645, radar picked up contacts. Unknown, massive, closing fast. Sprague peered through his binoculars and saw dark shapes rising from the mist. At first, he thought they were friendly cruisers, but the truth revealed itself in seconds. The towering pagoda masts, the black plumes of heavy guns. The Japanese had come. On the Yamato's bridge, Admiral Kurita watched the faint outlines of the American carriers. Tiny, slow, unarmored, easy prey. His officers murmured, "This was not the main American fleet. These were auxiliaries, sheep among wolves." Some laughed. "Just tin cans," one officer said. "Carriers for transport, not war." Kurita nodded slowly, but his eyes lingered. Something felt off. The Americans weren't running. Not yet. The first shells were already in the air, plunging toward their targets. The sea flashed white with impacts. Kurita's heart, though hardened by years of war, must have felt the unease of destiny. This was too easy, too perfect. At 0700 hours, Taffy 3's world erupted. Giant shell splashes rose around the carriers like geysers. Men dove for cover. Smoke screens billowed. Sprague's calm voice came over the radio. "All units, make smoke and open fire as opportunity permits. We'll do what we can." He knew they had no hope of matching the enemy's firepower. Their only chance was to confuse, to delay, to make the Japanese think they were facing something larger. And among those little ships, men like Commander Ernest Evans prepared to do exactly that. No one knew that within the next 3 hours the course of the battle, and perhaps the Pacific War itself, would shift on the backs of those so-called tin cans. Before the guns roared, before the sea burned, there was silence. Aboard the USS Johnston, the crew moved with the quiet rhythm of habit. Sailors checking ammunition hoists, torpedomen aligning tubes, gunners wiping condensation from their sights. They had drilled this 100 times, but this morning felt different. The air itself was tense, heavy with something unspoken. On the bridge, Commander Ernest Edwin Evans stood barefoot. He often removed his shoes in battle, said he could feel his ship better that way. A superstition perhaps, but to the men it was a sign. The captain was ready. Evans was 36, broad-shouldered, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. Half Cherokee, half Scots-Irish, a mixture of iron and instinct. He wasn't born to command destroyers, he was born to fight them. His crew called him the Chief, though never to his face. They respected him, not because he was fearless, but because he didn't ask his men to do anything he wouldn't do himself. When the first Japanese shells whistled overhead, Evans stepped to the bridge rail and squinted into the mist. He saw the silhouettes emerging from the dawn, massive battleships, flanked by cruisers and destroyers, their guns already flashing. He turned to his officers and said calmly, "Gentlemen, there's the whole Japanese fleet." A pause. Then quietly, "We'll attack them." What followed was not the reaction of men who doubted. No one argued. No one asked why. Orders rippled through the ship like a pulse. Engines roared to full power. Gunners swung their turrets. Torpedomen readied the tubes. The destroyer shuddered as she accelerated, a small, lean predator charging toward giants. On the radio, Admiral Sprague's voice echoed across the fleet. "All ships of Taffy 3, open fire and make smoke." Columns of white smoke began to bloom across the sea, drifting like ghosts between the carriers and the enemy. Behind the smoke, the thin-skinned escort carriers began to turn away, their decks crowded with men scrambling to launch aircraft, any aircraft, with any weapon they had left. But ahead, out of the smoke, Johnston cut a straight line toward the Japanese. Down below, the heat was suffocating. In the engine room, sailors stripped to their waists, soaked in sweat and oil. They couldn't see the battle, but they could feel it. Every shell that landed near the ship sent a shudder through the deck plates. Chief Engineer Mac McCoy wiped his forehead, looked at the temperature gauge, and muttered, "She's giving us everything she's got." Above, on the gun deck, Gunner's Mate First Class Paul Carr adjusted his sights. He was just 24, a farm boy from Texas. He'd written a letter home 2 days earlier, promised his mother he was doing fine, and that the Japs didn't stand a chance. Now, the horizon was full of them. At 0710 hours, Evans ordered, "Commence torpedo run." The ship lurched as she turned broadside to the enemy, racing in at 30 knots. The sea boiled white around her hull. Japanese shells screamed overhead, each one large enough to tear the ship apart in a single hit. Range, 10,000 yards. Set depth, 5 feet. Fire 1. 5 silver torpedoes shot into the water, leaving trails of white foam toward the oncoming cruisers. Moments later, a thunderclap rolled across the sea. One of the torpedoes struck the heavy cruiser Kumano, tearing her bow open and sending fire through her decks. The bridge erupted in cheers, short, fierce, human. Then Evans's voice cut through. "Cease celebrating. Keep firing." The Johnston now drew the full attention of the Japanese vanguard. Shells rained down in terrifying precision. One struck the bridge, killing helmsman Ensign Copeland instantly. Another tore through the aft deck, blowing men overboard. The ship shuddered but kept fighting. Evans, blood running down his neck, barked new orders. He refused medical attention. When the bridge was hit again, he moved to the open deck to command from there, standing exposed, shouting commands through the chaos. "Keep firing! Don't let them through!" Each 5-inch gun thundered until the barrels glowed red. The destroyer's thin hull vibrated with every shot. Smoke poured from her stacks, mingling with the gray dawn. And somewhere in the chaos, Evans smiled. Not in defiance, but in grim satisfaction. They were no longer running. They were fighting. Behind Johnston, other destroyers followed her lead. Howell and Heermann surged forward, launching their own torpedo runs. The smaller Samuel B. Roberts, barely half their size, joined in, charging at a cruiser 10 times her tonnage. The Japanese gunners, overwhelmed by the audacity of the attack, hesitated. Reports to Admiral Kurita's flagship were confused. "Enemy cruisers closing fast. No, destroyers. They are attacking." For the first time, the Japanese line wavered. And amidst that confusion, Ernest Evans's destroyer disappeared into the smoke. Scarred, burning, but still fighting. If there was ever a moment that captured the soul of Samar, it was that one. A single man, on a ship made of thin steel, charging into the jaws of the world's most powerful fleet, not to win, but to buy time for others to live. It wasn't strategy. It wasn't glory. It was duty. Pure, reckless, human duty. The men aboard Johnston didn't see themselves as heroes. They were just sailors doing their job. But as the sun climbed higher and the smoke thickened, history began to take shape around them, written not in ink, but in fire and salt water. And in that moment, Commander Evans, barefoot, bleeding, unwavering, became something more than a name in a battle report. He became the heartbeat of a fleet that refused to die quietly. The sea had become a furnace. By 07:20 hours, the calm waters off Samar were gone, replaced by pillars of smoke, geysers of flame, and the thunder of naval gunfire echoing across 20 miles of ocean. The horizon was no longer blue, but gray and orange, like a world at the edge of burning. From above, it must have looked like madness. Tiny specks, the tin can destroyers, darting through curtains of spray and smoke, firing at the towering shapes of battleships that loomed like black mountains. It wasn't a battle of equals. It was defiance written in steel. The USS Johnston, though wounded, charged again. Commander Ernest Evans refused to break contact. His destroyer weaved through shell splashes, closing the range until her 5-inch guns could at least reach the Japanese cruiser's superstructures. "Target the bridge! The turrets! Fire for effect!" Each salvo shook the deck. The guns roared until they overheated. Sailors worked with bare hands, passing shells blistering hot from the magazines. The men's faces were streaked with sweat and soot, their ears ringing from the constant concussion. One sailor later said, "You couldn't hear the captain's voice anymore. You could only feel his intent." Evans was fighting not just a battle, but time. Every minute Johnston held the enemy. The escort carriers to the east gained another mile of distance, another chance to survive. At 07:24, the USS Hull made her own torpedo run. Commander Leon Kintberger ordered a sharp turn toward the enemy column. He knew it would expose the ship's broadside, But there was no other choice. Through his binoculars, he could see the Japanese cruisers advancing, long lines of gray steel flashing with muzzle fire. "Range 12,000 yards!" his torpedo officer shouted. "Fire all tubes!" The torpedoes leapt into the water, white wakes streaking toward the enemy. Moments later, the sea erupted. A massive explosion tore into the heavy cruiser Chikuma, flooding her engine room and forcing her out of formation. But Hoel was hit moments later, a direct strike from Yamato's secondary guns. The explosion tore open her bow. Men were thrown into the air like rag dolls. Kintberger steadied himself, shouted through the din, "Keep firing, damn it! Keep firing!" They did. Even as fires spread and compartments flooded, Hoel fought on, every gun still blazing until power failed. At Aero 830, she rolled to starboard and sank, her colors still flying. The USS Heermann was the only destroyer left fully operational. Commander Amos Hathaway drove her straight into the chaos, weaving between shell splashes as big as houses. At one point, the destroyer found herself charging directly toward the battleship Congo, a leviathan of steel bristling with 14-inch guns. "Range 9,000 yards!" shouted the fire control officer. "Open fire!" The first salvo struck Congo's upper decks, setting her secondary turrets ablaze. The Japanese battleship turned away briefly, confused by the aggression of such a small target. Then Heermann swung around, launching torpedoes at another cruiser, Haguro. None struck home, but the effect was psychological. The Japanese formation, once perfect and disciplined, began to splinter. Commanders hesitated, unsure of what they were facing. Reports screamed across Kurita's flag bridge. Enemy cruisers, carriers, destroyers, no one could tell how many. Kurita's staff began to believe they had stumbled upon the vanguard of Admiral Halsey's main fleet. Fear began to seep into the steel. Meanwhile, the smallest of them all, the destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts, joined the charge. Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland knew his ship wasn't built for this. She carried only 2 5-inch guns and 3 torpedo tubes. But when he saw the other destroyers charging, he said simply, "If they're going in, we're going with them." At Aero 800, Samuel B. Roberts accelerated to flank speed, 28 knots, faster than her design allowed. The whole ship vibrated from the strain. Copeland stood at the bridge, wind tearing at his uniform, as the destroyer sliced through the smoke toward the cruiser Chokai. At 9,000 yards, he gave the order, "Fire torpedoes!" 3 torpedoes sped into the void. One found its mark. Chokai shuddered, flames pouring from her decks. Samuel B. Roberts turned broadside, opening up with her 2 main guns, firing faster than her design could handle. One sailor shouted, "We're firing faster than any 5-inch in the Navy." They fired 600 rounds in under 35 minutes. Then the return fire came. Heavy shells from Chokai and Congo raked her decks. One hit the engine room, killing everyone inside. Still, the guns kept firing. When Samuel B. Roberts finally sank, her survivors clung to debris, watching the sea burn. They called her the destroyer escort that fought like a battleship. The Japanese fleet, once an unstoppable wall of steel, was now in disarray. Kurita's bridge was chaos. Reports conflicted. Smoke covered the horizon. His officers saw phantom fleets in every direction. American aircraft, uncoordinated, lightly armed, some carrying only depth charges, swarmed overhead, diving again and again into the firestorm. Every plane looked like the prelude to another torpedo attack. Every destroyer seemed to hide a larger force behind it. Kurita had the advantage in power, but he had lost the advantage of clarity. He could not see the truth, that he was fighting only a handful of small ships, held together by courage and smoke. By Aero 900, Johnston was burning badly. She had been hit by over 20 shells and a torpedo. Half her guns were out. Her speed had dropped to 17 knots. Evans, still on deck, gave orders to protect the retreating carriers. His voice was hoarse but calm. He turned toward his bridge crew and said, "This is as far as we go. We've done what we came for." Then he looked east, where the slow escort carriers were still moving, still alive. He smiled faintly. They'll make it. Minutes later, Johnston took her final hit, a broadside from Congo. The destroyer staggered, smoke pouring from every hatch. At 09:45, Evans gave his last command. Abandon ship. He was last seen on the deck, waving survivors into the water. The sea swallowed him, barefoot, calm, resolute. When the echoes faded, the battle still raged in the air. The carriers launched every plane they could, Avengers, Wildcats, even unarmed observation aircraft, each one diving again and again to harass the Japanese fleet. At intro 9:30, Admiral Kurita, overwhelmed and uncertain, made the unthinkable decision. He ordered his fleet to retreat. The most powerful surface fleet Japan had left, turned back by destroyers made of tin. When the roar faded, there was only the sound of fire in the sea. The battle off Samar had lasted barely 3 hours, but for the men who fought it, time had stopped somewhere between the first shell and the last prayer. The sky was choked with smoke and ash. The sea glittered with oil and burning wreckage. All that was left of the once proud destroyers were fragments, drifting steel and the scattered voices of survivors calling out in the haze. And yet, amid the wreckage, life persisted. The survivors of the USS Johnston clung to rafts and floating debris, their faces blackened by soot, their uniforms shredded. Oil slicks coated the water, thick, sticky, suffocating. Some men had been blown overboard when the torpedo struck. Others had jumped in after their ship began to list. They watched her go down slowly, stern first. The destroyer that had charged a fleet 300 times her weight slipped beneath the waves without a sound. No one cheered, no one cried. They just watched. Radio man Dwayne Hodges, clinging to a plank, whispered, "She fought like a wolf." Someone else answered, "She was a wolf." Further north, survivors of the Hole floated in a tangled cluster of rafts. The sea was littered with flotsam, life jackets, ammunition boxes, charred bits of canvas. A few feet away, Ensign Henry McDonald blinked the salt from his eyes and saw a torpedo officer still clutching his firing key as if waiting for one last order. McDonald tried to lighten the mood. "Well," he said, his voice hoarse, "I'd say we made a pretty good distraction." A chuckle rippled through the group. In that dark humor was something sacred, the sailors' quiet defiance in the face of everything. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, blistering their skin. Sharks began to circle. Men prayed. Others told stories. One sailor recited lines from the Bible, haltingly. "Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends." No one replied, but every man heard it. The sea was wide, and the survivors were scattered across miles of open water. From one raft, Chief Torpedo Man Bob Hagan looked toward the horizon and thought he saw shapes. Maybe ships, maybe mirages. He'd been with Evans on the bridge until the end, had seen the captain still shouting orders through the smoke. Someone asked, "You think the captain made it?" Hagan didn't answer right away. He finally said, "If he didn't, he went down the way he wanted to." They all nodded. On another raft, Seaman First Class Bill Mercer tried to keep his friend awake. "Stay with me, Joe. Come on, man. Just keep your eyes open." Joe's lips were cracked, his voice barely a whisper. "I can't feel my legs." "You don't need 'em," Mercer said. "We're floating. Just hang on." They drifted in silence for a long time. Finally, Joe said, "Did we stop them?" Mercer looked at the sky, squinting into the light. He didn't know. He wanted to say yes. But before he could answer, a distant rumble echoed across the water, the sound of ships turning away, and Mercer smiled. "Yeah, Joe, we stopped them." On the carriers, those slow, vulnerable jeep carriers that had been the reason for the destroyer's charge, men stood at the rails, scanning the smoke for any sign of their escorts. Some cried openly. Others saluted the empty sea. Lieutenant Harold Butts, a pilot from Gambier Bay, wrote later in his diary, We saw our destroyers charge through the smoke like ghosts. They vanished one by one, but the Japanese turned around. The little ships saved us all. I've never seen such courage. I doubt I ever will again. When rescue finally came, over 50 hours later, the survivors had been adrift for 2 nights and 3 days. Many were burned. Many had gone blind from salt water and sun. Some had died of wounds or exposure. And yet, when the rescue ships pulled alongside, the survivors tried to stand and salute. The rescuers had to shout for them to sit down. Among the survivors, some were delirious. Others sang. A few asked for news of their captain. One sailor, trembling from dehydration, whispered, "Tell the Navy the Johnston fought until she couldn't fight anymore." That message would be passed along the line, repeated in wardrooms and offices, until it reached the very top of the chain of command. When the official reports came in, few could believe them. 4 destroyers and destroyer escorts, Johnston, Howell, Heermann, Samuel B. Roberts, had charged an entire Japanese center fleet. 4 battleships, 8 cruisers, 11 destroyers. They sank or crippled 3 heavy cruisers, damaged several others, and forced Admiral Kurita to retreat. It was, by every metric, impossible. And yet, it happened. The Japanese commanders, who had once laughed at the tin cans, later described their confusion in the battle's aftermath. One officer aboard Yamato wrote, "We did not understand. These small ships attacked as if they were battleships. They charged through our line as if possessed." He wasn't wrong. They were possessed. By duty, by loyalty, by something greater than survival. Back in the United States, the news trickled in slowly. Families received telegrams, some with relief, many with heartbreak. In Pawnee, Oklahoma, a woman named Mildred Evans opened her front door to a Navy officer in uniform. He removed his hat, looked at her gently, and said, "Ma'am, your husband, Commander Ernest E. Evans, is missing in action." She didn't cry. She simply nodded. "He told me once," she said quietly, "that if he ever went down, it would be fighting." She was right. Months later, when the war was over, Congress awarded Commander Ernest Evans the Medal of Honor, the first Native American in the U.S. Navy to receive it. The citation read, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity, at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty, he unhesitatingly commanded his ship to attack a vastly superior force, and gallantly gave his life for his country." But medals and citations could never capture the truth. The real measure of the men of Taffy 3 wasn't written in the official language of war. It was written in the eyes of the sailors who survived, and in the silence of the ones who didn't. The battle off Samar remains, to this day, one of the most extraordinary acts of courage in naval history. A handful of destroyers and escort carriers, outgunned and outnumbered, stopped an entire fleet through audacity alone. It wasn't just a battle, it was a statement. That courage could exist even in hopelessness. That sometimes, even when you know you can't win, you fight anyway. When the last gun fell silent over the Philippine Sea, a strange quiet settled on the world. The war raged on, Leyte was secured, and Japan's navy was shattered. But for the men of Taffy 3, the ocean had become a graveyard of memories. The survivors returned home scattered and thin, their faces weathered beyond their years. They spoke softly, if at all, about Samar. Most couldn't explain what had happened, or why it had worked. They only knew that when the order came to fight, they fought, and that somehow, impossibly, they'd lived through it. In the immediate aftermath, Samar was almost overshadowed by the sheer scale of the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval engagement in history. Admirals and analysts focused on the massive fleet actions farther north, on Yamato's retreat, on Halsey's chase after the decoy carriers. For a time, the tin cans were little more than a footnote in official reports. Their actions were called spirited, gallant, unexpected, but those words barely hinted at what had truly happened. It was only when the survivors began to gather, in hospitals, in veterans' halls, in dimly lit bars, that the story began to take shape. Each man carried a fragment of the battle, a flash of gunfire, a last order shouted through the smoke, a friend disappearing beneath the waves. Together, those fragments formed a mosaic of defiance so pure it defied doctrine. For many, coming home was harder than the battle itself. Bob Hagan of the Johnston used to wake up screaming from dreams of burning water. Bill Mercer avoided swimming pools. He said the smell of chlorine reminded him of oil and blood. Others never spoke of it again, believing that no one who hadn't been there could ever truly understand. In the small towns scattered across America, widows and mothers received medals wrapped in folded flags. Letters were read, framed, and placed on mantels. A few lines written before battle became lifetimes of remembrance. Mildred Evans, Ernest's widow, never remarried. Every Memorial Day, she'd visit the Pawnee Cemetery and place a small wooden plaque under the flagpole. It bore her husband's words, spoken to his crew before the Johnston launched. "This is going to be a fighting ship. I intend to go in harm's way, and anyone who doesn't want to go along, better get off right now." No one had left. For 75 years, the Johnston slept in silence, more than 4 miles beneath the Pacific. Her story lived on in books and the fading memories of old sailors, but her body, her twisted steel skeleton, was lost to the deep. Then, in 2019, a private expedition led by researcher and explorer Victor Vescovo located a debris field 21,000 feet below the surface. 2 years later, they returned with a remotely operated submersible. And there she was. The footage showed her bow still proud, the bridge mostly intact, the gun barrels angled toward where the Japanese fleet had once been. Her hull number, 557, was still visible through the sediment. When Vescovo announced the find, he said softly, "She fought to the end. Even here you can see it." For the surviving families, it wasn't closure. It was something quieter, a confirmation that the ship had never truly vanished. She'd just gone home. The destroyers and destroyer escorts of Taffy 3 were never meant to be heroes. They were built for convoy escort and submarine patrol, utility ships, not war-winning weapons. But in the crucible of Samar, they proved that courage could compensate for steel. Their actions became a case study in leadership and initiative. Naval cadets at Annapolis still study Samar, not for tactics, but for the moral of it. How a small unit, facing annihilation, can change the outcome of a battle through willpower alone. In 1988, the Navy dedicated the Tin Can Sailors Monument in Massachusetts. The bronze plaque reads simply, "They fought above their weight and beyond their duty." And at every Navy destroyer reunion, someone eventually raises a glass to the memory of Evans, Copeland, Kintberger, and the men who went down with their ships. In 2005, during an estate sale in Oklahoma, a collector found a small tin box marked E. Evans, USS Johnston. Inside was a single unsent letter, dated October 22, 1944. It was written in Evans's sharp, deliberate hand. "To be opened if I don't return. If this finds you, it means I did what I had to do. The sea is cruel, but she is honest. Tell our boys that sometimes duty is heavier than a mountain, but it's what makes a man. I don't know what tomorrow holds, but I know who we are. We're sailors. We fight until we can't." The letter was never meant for history, but somehow it became the essence of Samar, a promise kept. Today, when sailors walk the decks of modern destroyers, guided by satellites and radar, armed with missiles that can strike across continents, they still hear the story of Samar, not as myth, but as measure. It reminds them that ships, no matter how advanced, are only as strong as the men who crew them. And that in war, technology matters less than resolve. Because the men of Taffy 3 didn't fight for victory. They fought because someone had to stand in the way. And that, in the end, is the purest kind of courage. At dawn on October 25th each year, a small ceremony is held at sea, sometimes aboard destroyers in the Pacific, sometimes on museum ships. The sailors gather quietly at the rail, the ocean stretching endless around them. A bell is struck 6 times, once for each ship that fought, once for those who didn't return. Then, as the sun breaks the horizon, the words are spoken. To the men of Taffy 3, you are not forgotten. The wind carries the sound over the waves. Somewhere out there, deep beneath the water, the Johnston, Hole, and Samuel B. Roberts still rest, their hulls sleeping in the dark. But the echoes remain. In the crash of surf, in the hum of engines, in the quiet courage of every sailor who's ever faced the impossible. And if you listen closely, you can almost hear it. The whisper of guns in the fog, the voice of a barefoot captain saying, "Turn toward the storm." When the smoke finally cleared from the waters off Samar, the scale of what had happened began to take shape. The air still shimmered with the smell of cordite and burning oil. Waves carried pieces of wood, steel, and human memory, drifting in silence. The Japanese fleet, though vastly superior, was retreating. Admiral Takeo Kurita, once the hunter, was now the haunted. He had entered the battle with the mightiest surface force left in the Japanese Empire. 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, the great Yamato herself. Yet by noon on October 25th, he turned away. Not because he was beaten by firepower, but by confusion, fear, and the ghostly courage of ships that should not have fought back. As Kurita's battleships lumbered through the smoke, his bridge was a place of disbelief. Reports came in of heavy losses, Chikuma, Chokai, and Suzuya gone. Kumano crippled, ammunition running low. But more than that, he no longer knew what he was facing. His lookouts claimed they'd seen fast carriers, cruisers, even battleships. The smoke and chaos had deceived his fleet. The destroyers, those tin cans, had charged so fiercely, fired so fast, and maneuvered so wildly that many Japanese officers believed they were facing a full American task force. And above, the sky kept sending attack after attack. Wildcats, Avengers, even unarmed planes making dry runs to keep the Japanese guessing. Kurita's radio operator later wrote, "The enemy was everywhere, in the clouds, in the smoke, in our minds." Shortly before noon, Kurita ordered his fleet to disengage. He turned north, away from the transports, away from Leyte, away from victory. For the Japanese Navy, it was the last chance lost. For Taffy 3, the cost was unbearable. 3 destroyers, Johnston, Hole, and Samuel B. Roberts, lay beneath the sea. Carrier Gambier Bay, the only American carrier sunk by surface gunfire, was gone. Hundreds of men were dead. Dozens more would die in the water, waiting for rescue that wouldn't come for 2 days. Sharks took some. Exhaustion took others. Those who survived remembered the cries at night, men calling out names, praying, whispering songs to stay awake. One survivor of Hole, Seaman Jack Hewson, later said quietly, "When the sun came up, we counted fewer heads. That's when you stopped being afraid. You just hoped it would end soon." When word reached Admiral William Halsey that Kurita had broken through, disbelief spread through the fleet. By the time he turned his battleship south, the fight was already over. In Washington, the first reports from Samar were met with confusion. How could escort carriers and destroyers have faced battleships, and won? But the communiques were consistent. The Japanese had fled. The invasion at Leyte was safe. History would soon call it the Battle off Samar, but for those who lived it, it was something else. The day the tin cans fought giants. Samar marked the final surface victory of the U.S. Navy, and the effective end of Japan's ability to wage major naval war. The Yamato, which had escaped the battle nearly unscathed, would die 6 months later on a one-way mission to Okinawa, bombed and sunk by waves of carrier planes. She would never again fire her guns in anger. Kurita returned to Japan and never commanded again. He refused to speak publicly about Samar, except to say one thing to an interviewer years later. "I turned back because I could no longer bear the sight of my men dying for nothing." In that simple sentence lay the end of the Imperial Navy's spirit, a silence heavier than defeat. Those who survived Taffy 3 were scattered across the Pacific, reassigned to other ships, other wars. But something inside them had changed. They had seen the impossible and lived through it. Some felt pride, others guilt. All carried the same memory, of ships charging into flame, of friends who never came home. Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland of Samuel B. Roberts later said in a reunion, "We were ordinary men who found ourselves in an extraordinary place. We didn't win the battle. We just didn't lose it." That quiet distinction, not victory, not glory, but survival with honor, became the true legacy of Samar. Today, the Philippine Sea is calm. Fishermen cross the same waters where shells once fell like rain. Beneath them lie the rusted bones of ships and men: Johnston, Hoel, Gambier Bay, Samuel B. Roberts. Sometimes divers report strange echoes on sonar, faint, rhythmic sounds like distant hammering. They fade quickly, probably nothing. But the old sailors like to believe it's the heartbeat of Taffy 3, still echoing under the waves. The ocean, after all, never forgets. It simply keeps its secrets until someone listens closely enough. When the war ended, no parades were held for the men of Samar, no grand speeches. But in quiet corners of history, their story became legend, not of victory, but of valor. Their courage bought time, their defiance saved an army, their names became whispered lessons in naval academies around the world. That courage is not measured in tonnage or firepower, but in how far a man is willing to go when all reason says to run. And in that lesson, the battle off Samar became something greater than war. It became a mirror. For in every age there comes a moment when men and women must face overwhelming odds, when fear and duty collide, when all that remains is the choice to turn or to stand. Dawn comes softly over the Pacific. The same sun that once rose over fire and smoke now glimmers on a quiet sea. The waters are calm, indifferent, yet beneath them sleep the ships that once defied reason itself. 80 years have passed. The war is gone, but the echoes remain. If you listen long enough, to the hiss of the wind, to the rhythm of the waves, you can almost hear them. The clatter of shells being loaded, the hum of a destroyer's engine straining for every knot, the voice of a captain shouting over the roar of the guns, "All ahead flank! Fire as you bear!" It is faint now, like an old recording played through the years, but it is still there. Because some stories never fade. History often remembers the great names, the admirals, the fleets, the nations. But Samar was not written by admirals. It was written by men whose names never made the newspapers. A radio man who stayed at his post even when the bulkhead split. A gunner who refused to leave the turret as the deck tilted beneath him. A medic who tore up his own shirt to bandage a friend's wound. Men who didn't die for glory, but for each other. That is the quiet truth of war. Not triumph, not empire, but the heartbeat of ordinary souls standing where the world expected them to fall. Every man who fought that morning faced a moment of choice, to run or to turn. There was no time for speeches, no room for strategy, only instinct. And that instinct, to protect, to fight, to not abandon the helpless, became something larger than command or obedience. It became human. They were told they were too small, too light, too weak, and yet they turned toward the storm. It wasn't courage born of confidence. It was courage born of necessity, of knowing that if they did not act, no one else would. That kind of courage leaves a scar. It does not boast. It does not sing. It endures, quietly. At the bottom of the Philippine Sea, 3 hulls lie side by side. Johnston, Hoel, Samuel B. Roberts. They rest in the dark, untouched by time. No monuments, no applause. Only pressure, silence, and the soft drift of silt. And yet, that darkness is not empty, because memory is its own kind of light. Every time a ship sails those waters, every time a young sailor reads their story, those names rise again, carried by the tide, whispered through the steel of every destroyer that bears the legacy of the tin cans. In that way, they never sank. Samar was not a victory, it was a revelation, that even in the machinery of war there is still room for the soul. That steel can burn, ships can sink, empires can vanish, but the will to do what is right, even when it seems hopeless, endures. War shows the worst of humanity. But sometimes, in the unlikeliest moments, it reveals the best. When the last survivor of Taffy 3 is gone, their story will remain, not as legend, but as warning. Because courage like theirs is not born from hatred, but from love. Love for shipmates, for duty, for the idea that some things are still worth standing for, even when the world is falling apart. And so the sea remembers. It remembers the thunder of battle, the flash of steel, the final cry of defiance that still echoes beneath the waves. When the sun sets over Samar, the horizon glows gold for a moment. And if you stand there in silence, you might almost hear it again. The hum of engines, the heartbeat of courage, the whisper of history saying, they were only tin cans, but they were made of something stronger.